Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the TEFL Development Hub for another Thursday webinar. And this morning, I feel really privileged to be joined by Dr. Anne Margaret Smith, who's going to be talking to us about including dyslexic language learners. This is a topic I was just saying to Anne Margaret before. It's a topic I feel like I don't know much about, hardly anything, I would say. And also that I feel like I don't have any experience of dyslexic language learners in my classes, possibly because of a lack of awareness of what to look for and how dyslexia might show itself in language learners. So I'm really looking forward to learning more this morning as well. So Dr. Anne Margaret Smith, she's got an extensive career in ELT, and she set up ELT Well in 2005 to combine this knowledge of ELT with knowledge of neurodiversity. So she's going to tell us a little bit more about neurodiversity in general, and then talk about some practical ideas for including dyslexic language learners. And just one more thing to mention, she's continuously learning herself as well, and she's currently studying to be a speech and language therapist, so adding more strings to her bow as well. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Anne Margaret. I'll be on the chat if anybody has any questions.
Thanks very much, Teresa. Lovely to be here in the TEFL Development Hub, and obviously very pleased to be talking about my favourite subject. I have warned Teresa that if I just seem to be droning on and it's getting towards tea time, then she's got to just tell me to stop. I'll keep an eye on the time, don't worry. So I'm going to be talking about including dyslexic language learners. I'm going to start by just saying a little bit about what it means to be dyslexic or neurodivergent. And the sorts of things that we might look out for in our classroom, because I think Teresa's experience is quite common, that many teachers maybe haven't realised that they have a student who is dyslexic, dyspraxic, autistic. Maybe the students haven't realised either, because it's not identified everywhere. Sometimes the processes are quite slow or not very effective. So I think it's really worthwhile English language teachers knowing what the signs could be, what to look for, and then, I mean, not necessarily pushing through the process of assessment, that's not appropriate all the time, but being aware and then knowing what things might need to be adapted or how best to support those learners. I think that's what English language teachers really need. So, the best way, I think, for English language teachers to recognise dyslexia and other specific learning differences, so SBLD, specific learning difference, is to look at the impact on the learning. I imagine that most people watching this have heard of dyslexia. You've probably heard of ADHD, dyspraxia, autism. Dyscalculia might not be so familiar, but I'll just run through them and just say the sorts of things that you might notice in your learners. So with your dyslexic learners, there might be an issue with processing either spoken or written language. You might find as well that when they come to explain their ideas, that the ideas don't appear to be in what we might consider a linear or logical order. They might be kind of dotting about from idea to idea. And that's because they'll be making connections, which for me, because I'm not dyslexic, I perhaps find it hard to see what the connections are between their ideas. For them, the connections are obvious. It's because they're seeing the world in a very different way. And that's really the core feature of neurodiversity. And I would just say at this point that actually the human population is neurodiverse, so everybody's brain is a little bit different. But there are some people whose brains are really quite different from the majority, and they are seeing the world differently, they're processing information differently, they're making different connections, they're responding differently to the input that everybody else is getting as well. So in terms of neurodiversity, yeah, that's a population-wide phenomenon, and we're looking for the people who are perhaps, sometimes we say neurodivergent, so quite different from their peers. And that might come through, as I say, in the way that they process information and in the way that they explain their ideas. With ADHD, attention deficit, and sometimes hyperactivity disorder. The issues are about paying attention and about focusing on one thing for a long time. It's actually not a deficit of attention, it's the wrong name, and that name is stuck and I don't know how we get rid of it. It's not a deficit of attention, it's actually paying attention to everything all at once. And if you think about that, that must be quite exhausting for them. Everything that's happening is equally important. Most of us have filters that we can just kind of ignore anything that's not relevant to the task that we're doing. But when those filters are not working properly, that's when you get students who are constantly distracted by what's going on outside the window or on the other side of the classroom, or by how tight their socks are, or any little thing could be distracting for them. And you might see this in the classroom. You might see students who are a little bit restless and they're constantly kind of fidgeting and moving. They may not be good at waiting to take their turn. Because they may have like a fantastic idea and they want to jump in and immediately share that idea and not be able to wait until it's their turn. And it may also affect their emotional control. Now, if you're working with older learners, I normally work with adults. Often by adulthood, people have more or less got that under control, but not entirely. And if you're working with younger learners, you'll certainly see that they could swing from being very, very happy, almost euphoric, to being extremely angry, furious, something's gone wrong and it's not fair and it's not their fault and it's always happening to them. You can see a big swing in emotions quite quickly. So that's something to be on the lookout for. It's always worth talking to students about how they're feeling, of course, and we'll come on to that a little bit later. Dyspraxia is about the coordination and sequencing of movements, and that can affect their fine motor control or indeed their gross motor control. So that might show up in handwriting, for example. Obviously, when we're writing, our hand movements are extremely precise and need to be in a particular order in order to form the letters. When we're speaking, equally, the movements that we make in our mouths have to be very precise and sequenced properly. So it could affect their articulation in their own language, as well as, you know, when they're learning another language, that's a whole new set of mouth movements that they have to learn and sequence. And that could be like a big challenge for dyspraxic learners. It also affects spatial awareness, so judging distance. So you might see students who bump into things, drop things. And in their text, when they're writing, they may not judge like margins, or they may not judge how big the line, you know, the space between the lines. Those sorts of spatial awareness issues you might see in their written work as well. Temporal awareness, so they might not know how long a task is going to take them. They might not be able to judge how long it will take them to get to class from where they've been. So students who might be always a little bit late because they just haven't quite recognized that it's going to take them 10 minutes to get from where they were to your class. And they might not remember where your class is as well, so they might be lost looking for your classroom. And they might be very sensitive to the environment. So I'm going to be talking later about environmental sensitivity as well. This is also a feature of autism, actually. But with autism, the thing that we often notice first is the social interaction patterns, that they can be quite unusual. And they may not, in their first language, they may not have picked up all of the sort of norms about social interaction, how close you stand to somebody, when it's your turn to speak, what sort of things are appropriate to say. So if you then have to learn a whole new set of norms for a new language, that could be a huge challenge. They might need some explicit coaching in some of those aspects of communication, like, you know, when is it your turn to speak? When is it okay to start a conversation? How close do you stand? Do you look somebody in the eye, or do you look away? Or all these little things, which the sort of paralinguistic aspects of language might be quite a big challenge for autistic students. And unfortunately, in terms of learning English, they may not be very tolerant of inconsistency and change. So even right at the start of learning English, when you start to learn the verb to be, you start to notice that there are strange things happening. You can say, I'm not, he's not, but you can't say, I amn't, whereas you can say, he isn't. You know, things like that could be actually quite confusing and disturbing for people who don't tolerate inconsistency very well. Sorry, and I should say I amn't is possible in some varieties of English. Scottish English, for example, it may be possible, but not in the sort of standard English that's normally taught in ELT. And also understanding metaphors, all the little idioms that we often use, may not make any sense at all. They may have quite literal interpretations. So we just need to think about the language that we're using, and if we are going to use idioms, to explain what they mean, and if we can, where they've come from and why that has become a figure of speech in English. They may also have issues with understanding humour, sarcasm, for example, irony. But I think that holds for quite a lot of our learners. So it's just something for teachers to be aware of. If you see students who are having more difficulty than their peers, then that might be an indicator that they're further along the autism spectrum than the rest of the class. And so I come to dyscalculia, which is perhaps the least known and probably the least researched of these common specific learning differences. Dyscalculia is about numerical and temporal concepts. So it's about understanding greater or less than, understanding numbers and time again. So there's issues with temporal awareness. And in terms of language learning, that can impact on sequencing narrative. So what happened first, and what tenses would we use to express what happened first and then what? And also time expressions. If the learner has difficulty with time expressions in their own language, obviously that's going to be harder for them when they're learning another language. So that might show up. Or money. If you're doing role plays, for example, and you have a student who has to be I don't know, a bartender or a shopkeeper or something, and say how much something costs, they may actually have no clue at all the kind of scale of what something might cost. And it's not always clear whether it's just that they haven't got the number, you know, the number words right, or whether they actually don't have any clue at all how much £500 is. Do you know what I mean? So it may not be clear, but if you see consistently that that student is having issues around number and around time, it may be worth considering whether there is some dyscalculia present in their cognitive profile. It's not very common, but it, you know, it could explain, and then we might be able to support them with using number lines or some explicit coaching, really, in tenses and time expressions.
That's what I was thinking. So when you were talking about how these different neurodivergencies might manifest, is it much more difficult to spot them in second language learners?
It's not easy to spot them. What I would say is it's a process. When we get to know our learners, we're in a better position to understand what the challenges are. In terms of dyslexia, dyslexia is usually identified through literacy practices. When literacy practices don't develop, typically, often that's a signal that we need to investigate. When we're talking about people learning English as a second language, literacy practices often do lag behind their oral development because English orthography is kind of, yeah, it's not very learner friendly, is it? You know, it's quite complicated. Spelling patterns are not always very predictable. So in terms of dyslexia, it can be quite hard to differentiate. I wasn't going to talk about assessment, but if anybody's interested in identifying specific learning differences, I do have an assessment kit called CAMEL, which is Cognitive Assessments for Multilingual Learners. If you go to the ELT Well website, you'll be able to find out more about that and the sorts of things to look out for. But I should stress that it's not just one individual thing. So if you see a student who is a little bit restless, a little bit fidgety, that doesn't necessarily mean they've got ADHD. We're really looking for clusters and patterns of behaviour. But it's always worth having a conversation with a student just to find out how they're feeling and to find out, you know, if they are experiencing difficulties ongoing, or is it just temporary? Is it just today I'm having a bit of an off day? Is there something happening at home which might be affecting their concentration? You know, there's all sorts of things which could impact the learner in the classroom. Some of these things that I've talked about here could be sort of manifesting, even though it's not a cognitive difference, it's just like a temporary emotional social issue that's going on. So it's really important to get to know your learners, I think, on an individual basis. And over time, you start to see the patterns. Yeah. What we see, so these are the kind of core characteristics of the different specific learning differences, but there's a lot of common ground. And this yellow area here is where we see the common ground, which affects issues like memory, particularly working memory. We need a lot of working memory to learn a language, because that means we've got to hold information that's already in our minds. We've got to hold that whilst we introduce new information and somehow combine it. We do that a lot in language learning. So working memory is a big issue, which can affect students with any of these specific learning differences. So that's something we really need to be aware of. Those students who seem to understand quite quickly, but then by the end of the lesson they've forgotten. Those are students that might well have some form of specific learning difference going on. Speed of processing can be affected. So particularly dyslexic and dyspraxic students might need more time to process information and to formulate their answers and to complete tasks. Organization can be affected. So all of these kind of what we call executive functions, basically about planning, organizing, they can be affected by specific learning differences. So students who somehow turn up in the wrong room on the wrong day with the wrong homework, those kind of personal organization issues might be a sign that the student has a specific learning difference. And also organizing ideas. I mentioned in relation to dyslexia, the issues around organizing ideas in a text. Those sorts of things can be affected by the issues with executive function. Knowing what's important, knowing what to prioritize, knowing how to present information so that it's clear for other people what the connections are. And unfortunately, particularly with older learners, all of these things affect their learning, affect their success, and do often lead to eroded self-esteem. And I think most teachers know that can show up in a whole range of ways. I mean, there are lots of students who feel very anxious in language classrooms and just try and disappear. They don't want to be called on to answer a question. They don't really want to try out new constructs because they're so afraid of getting it wrong, because that's been their experience in the past. So they might be the kind of student that just kind of tries to disappear and tries not to be there. Or they might take a different tack and try to overcompensate. So they might actually come across as being quite arrogant and quite loud, and but that might just be a distraction from their sort of fragile self-esteem. So it's quite hard to gauge. But I think I always try and give students the benefit of the doubt. If there's somebody who seems really overconfident, it may just be overcompensation for the fact that they feel actually very anxious and quite vulnerable in the language classroom. And of course, students have good days and bad days. Well, we all do. We all do. But it can be quite extreme when there's a specific learning difference, because the effort that it takes to process information can be quite exhausting. So if you have a student who has a really good day and is really on the ball and is motivated and engaged and is doing really good work, and then the next day they come to class and it's like a different student, it's like they've forgotten what they did and they've got no energy and they can't be bothered, and you know, in a way it's not really surprising because the amount of effort that they must have put in, cognitive effort, to have a really good day has probably wiped them out. They're probably exhausted the next day. So you do see students who have really good days and then really bad days. And on those really bad days, I'm afraid there's not a lot you can do apart from try and understand and cut them a bit of slack. So those are the sort of the common features that we see in terms of SBLDs. And the thing is that students don't fit neatly into boxes. So even if a student comes to you and says, I've been identified as having dyslexia, that could mean anything really. It's a good starting point, and it's great that they've let you know, because then you can at least be aware and alert and try to get to know them better. But don't forget that just because they've been identified as having dyslexia, it doesn't mean that they don't also have characteristics from the other specific learning differences that we've talked about. Because as I say, you don't find people who just fit neatly into one box. And what dyslexia means, of course, is different for every individual as well. I have taught dyslexic learners who actually have quite good memories, but that's because they've worked really hard to develop those memory strategies. I've worked with dyslexic students who are actually really good at spelling, sometimes again because they've worked really hard on it. So it's really hard to predict what it will mean if somebody says to you, actually, I'm dyslexic. The best thing we can do is to take it on board, to talk to them about what their individual challenges are, and then to talk to them about what helps them in the classroom and what kind of things they might need a bit of extra support with. So it's a very individual thing, I would say. These are areas that we might want to work on, though, and actually, these are things which all language learners would benefit from. For memory strategies, I mean, who doesn't need better memory strategies? Even if you've got a really good memory, and I'm talking from personal experience here, as a young woman, I had a really good memory. If I heard something once, I could remember it. Now, as I'm becoming more mature, I'm finding that that's not the case anymore. But because I've spent 30 years teaching memory strategies, I've got a whole sort of toolkit of memory strategies that I can pull out when I need them, and I'm really grateful that I have. So whatever age group you're working, and no matter how good their memory seem to be, at some point it would benefit all students to develop more memory strategies, explicitly develop them, so that in the future they can draw on them, and they can draw on different strategies in different situations. And they may not remember your name, but they'll remember you as that teacher that helped them remember information in different ways, and they will thank you in the future. You can be sure of that. With speed of processing, you can't really speed up somebody's processing, but you can help them to develop shortcuts. So if you see that somebody needs more time to complete tasks, of course you can put strategies in place in the classroom. For example, instead of, if there's an exercise with 10 questions, instead of asking everybody to do all 10 questions, you could say, half the group, you're going to do the odd numbers, you're going to do the even numbers. If you get through them, of course, do the others. But if you do that, that's inclusive for everybody, because there'll be lots of people who wouldn't get through all 10, who would be feeling stressed. And of course, when we get stressed, we're not concentrating, we're just trying to get through the exercise. Much better if they just do a few questions, but do them well and feel like, yes, they've achieved what you asked them to do. So little things like that, you can put shortcuts in place for them. You can allow them to use whatever resources they find helpful, whether that's a dictionary or if they've got like a little cheat sheet of prepositions, whatever resources they find helpful to speed things up. Because if you need a lot of time to complete a task, you've really got to be thinking, what is the priority of that task? What is the purpose of that task? And how do I eliminate everything else so that the student can focus just on what the actual purpose of that task was? So helping them really to focus on one thing at a time rather than drowning in all the other things that are going on around it. With organisation, we can help students develop good organisation techniques. We can encourage them to use a diary. I'm a big fan. I've still got my little paper diary here. I'm a big fan of paper diaries. I mean, I've got my phone as well. And I mean, most students now have a phone. And the funny thing is that even though they might lose their homework, they don't lose their phones. I don't know if you've noticed that. Most students never lose their phones. So you can get them to use their phone, to use the calendar in their phones, get them to set reminders, make sure they know how long it will take them to get to class, and set a reminder for 10 minutes before they need to set off. You know, you can help them develop better organizational skills. And again, you know, they will thank you for that. And it's something you can do in the classroom as a classroom test, so that everybody can share whatever little strategies they have. You know, if they're the kind of person that have got post-it notes on their wall, maybe they can talk to other students about how that helps them. So everybody can contribute to that discussion, and everybody can learn from each other. And I think, you know, that's something that also helps to develop a more cohesive classroom. When you get students sharing their techniques, they start to see themselves more as a team rather than as an individual, you know, in competition with other people in the class. And a more collaborative learning environment is good for everybody. Which brings me on to self-esteem, because there are lots of things we can do to boost self-esteem. And one of the things we can do, obviously, is recognize the strengths that students have and any particular skills or any particular strategies or techniques that they have. We can recognize them and support them in that way. And that can be very, what's the word, empowering for them, and make them feel like, yeah, they can contribute to the class as well. They may be the student who always finishes last. They may be the student whose spelling isn't great, but maybe they're the student who's got great computer skills and can show people how to save and organize their files, or, you know, whatever it is. And with good days and bad days, as I've said before, there's nothing really we can do about it. Just accept that students aren't always going to be 100%. I mean, we're not always 100%, and sometimes we have to cut ourselves a bit of slack as well. But maybe just have that conversation with the student and let them know that if they come into class and they don't feel 100%, maybe they could just give you a signal. Maybe you have a system in class. Some teachers have little sort of traffic light signals, like a little roller thing that students have on their desk, and they can have green, orange, or red to sort of signal how they're feeling that day. So it could be a non-verbal signal, and they could just let you know how they're feeling, so that you don't exacerbate the situation. If they're having a really bad day, you just need to be supportive and just accept that they're not going to be at their best today, but maybe tomorrow they will be, you know. So just setting up a system that they can signal to you how they're feeling, I think is very helpful, because that tells them that you believe in them and that you support them, that you're not judging them. And when they trust you, they're much more likely to come to class, you know, willing to try at least. And when you've got that really positive relationship, I think students are much more willing to try their hardest because they want to please you. And, you know, that's a really important motivating factor in learning. So these are some very general things that we can think about in terms of students with specific learning differences. What I would say is that because co-occurrence is very common, we might also come across specific learning differences like DLD, which is developmental language disorder. One of the reasons that I actually started training to be a speech and language therapist, I'm halfway through the training now. The reason that I started is because working with dyslexic learners, I found there's a lot of students who also have some speech issues, speech sound disorders, or actual issues with producing language, syntax and semantics and so on. And I wanted to know more about it. And I'm discovering that there's a big overlap between developmental language disorder, DLD, and dyslexia, and also autism to some extent. So just being aware of where the overlaps are. Oh, prosopagnosia doesn't fit in that little overlap. That's about face recognition. That's my particular cognitive quirk. So students might have difficulty recognizing their classmates. I have difficulty recognizing my students sometimes. OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, where students are quite anxious about routine and about how things might go wrong if they don't do a particular thing. Tourette syndrome, which again can affect speech. That's when you have like a verbal tic, can be a physical tic as well. And there are so many more. We could talk about different forms of cognitive difference probably all day long. But just to be aware that specific learning differences do very often come in clusters like this. And so we talk about neurodiversity and neurodivergence. It's a useful umbrella term, and it covers the whole of the human population. Neurodiversity is the situation in any population. It's worth keeping in mind. So to have these kinds of discussions in class, to talk about how we're all different, and to talk about the things that we find easy and the things that we find more challenging, is a really good starting point in terms of including learners who are experiencing difficulties with their learning. And I've said this before, and I think at the heart of inclusive practice is that relationship in the classroom, that culture in the classroom, where it's okay to be you, it's okay to be different. It's okay if you need to ask me again how to spell that word, because I know I've told you 4 times, but okay, I understand that you haven't got it yet. To make that okay in your classroom is the best thing you can do in terms of inclusion. And the way that we do that is to have these discussions about how we're all different, and how wonderful that is, actually, how fascinating that is. And yes, it's funny. I mean, it's funny. People think it's funny when I don't recognize them, even though I've been teaching them for a year. Because I work with adults, if I have an adult learner who shaves his beard off, to me, that's a new student. I don't know this student. This is a new person in my class. And I honestly have done this. Somebody's come into my class and I've gone with my registration forms to say, oh, hi, welcome to the class. Would you like to, sign these registration forms? And they're looking at me like, you know who I am? I've been here for 6 months now. I mean, it's really embarrassing, but it's also really funny. So if you do have a cognitive quirk like I do, share that with the class. It's okay that we're all different. It's just part of the tapestry of the human population. So that's a great way into a more inclusive learning environment, that we accept that we're all different. And we talk about different neurotypes. That's quite a sort of neat shortcut, quite a useful term to talk about neurotypes, because that could be like dyslexia and dyspraxia, or it could be ADHD and autism. In fact, there are probably as many neurotypes as there are people on the planet. But as a shortcut, it's quite useful to sort of have a starting point. And what I would say is, in terms of developing our inclusive language classroom, so including dyslexic learners, and not just dyslexic learners, but including everybody, there are 3 things that we really need to think about. We need to think about the classroom environment, and I've spoken a little bit about the relationships. We need to think about the materials and the task. So I'll just go through these quickly and just try and offer some practical ideas here. In the physical environment, I'm talking about the physical environment, but some of these will also pertain to the virtual teaching environment. I know many of us have had to quickly learn how to manage that online classroom. There are some things that we need to think about. And when I mentioned before about sensitivity to the environment, I was thinking really in terms of temperature, lighting, noise levels. So there are some students who will be very, very sensitive to the temperature. They may feel that the classroom is really too hot and want to keep opening the windows. And that might be possible, that might not be possible. It might not be helpful. If it's really noisy outside, you might not want the window open. But it's worth checking with the students how they feel about the temperature. And of course, you'll get a range of answers. If you say, how's the temperature? Some people say, oh, it's a bit chilly. And there'll be some people who are feeling it's too hot. But I mean, just saying things like, we can put the heating on, or we can open the window, but what might be better is if you come in layers. I mean, I live in the northwest of England. Layers is your best way forward because you never know what the weather's going to be like. So just suggesting to people, you might want to come in layers, and then you can take a layer off, take your coat off, take your jacket off, take your jumper off, you know. And it sounds really odd that you might need to suggest that to students, particularly adult learners. But as I said right at the beginning, being neurodivergent means really seeing the world quite differently, and things which are really obvious to us may not be obvious to them. I have had to say to adult learners who have wanted to open the window, I've said, would it be worth maybe taking your jacket off first and seeing how that goes? You know, it's just not obvious to them, things which seem obvious to us, and of course vice versa. So check the temperature, check the lighting. Some people are very sensitive to artificial lighting, so they may want to sit by the window so they've got the benefit of natural light. Of course, the natural light might be too bright as well, so you might want to think about blinds. I mean, in extreme cases, you might suggest to students that they actually have some shades, sunglasses. You know, it might seem odd to wear sunglasses indoors, but that might be the best way forward to just to tone down the light if the light is quite harsh. Similarly with noise levels, what to us might be quite a nice sort of productive hum, you know, of students talking quietly and discussing issues, might actually be quite distracting for some learners, and they might just need to have their ear defenders on or earbuds in, noise cancelling, you know. Some students like to have a little bit of music on whilst they're working, if they're working independently. So, you know, sort of suggesting these things and saying, this is okay, we could do this, might be the way forward. Of course, I know that in some cases, in some schools, there may be rules about having earbuds in or having defenders on, but I think we do need to look at those rules on an individual basis and just, you know, decide what the rules are for and whether the rules are actually going to be counterproductive in some cases. So I do understand that everybody's context is going to be slightly different. You might need to negotiate with your manager, for example, if you're going to allow students to have their earphones in. In terms of furniture and equipment, I know, again, we don't always have a lot of say in how the rooms are laid out, but just thinking about how close students are sitting to each other. Some students need more space than others, is all I will say. I've often seen dyslexic learners, particularly, you know, they're quite, so they've got their elbows out. They need more elbow space. They do. Put them on the end of a row so they can at least, you know, put one elbow out. Just think about where's the best place for everybody to sit. What kind of furniture might be best. I mean, I know, again, we don't always have the budget to buy new furniture, but maybe sometimes we just do away with the tables completely and just have a circle of chairs, depending on what you're doing and the age group that you're working with. It's certainly worth having a think about whether your classroom environment is working for everybody, and maybe having a classroom discussion about what would be best. Let the students lead on where they would like to sit, how, you know, how comfortable they feel. Certainly let them have some input in that. In terms of materials and tasks, there's no right or wrong answer, but I would say in terms of materials, try and have the clearest layout possible. Unfortunately, a lot of EFL materials seem quite busy. You know, you have your page with your text and there's a picture behind the text, and it can be quite busy. If you're designing your own materials, go for it as clear as possible. Use multisensory activities wherever possible. So I think EFL teachers usually we're quite good at having visuals, and we are quite good at bringing in more auditory material. But if you can have something very tactile as well, that's an added bonus. And I think that's maybe where Realia is really useful. You know, if you're talking about fruit, bring in your fruit bowl. You know, let's have the fruit there. Make anything as stimulating as possible. So you're stimulating as many senses as possible. Students are more likely to engage and more likely to remember the sort of discussions that they have if they've got that sensory input as well. Think about the pace and the content. And unfortunately, again, a lot of EFL textbooks quite unrealistic about how much you can get through in a lesson realistically, or how much students can actually take in. In terms of vocabulary learning, for example, you often see textbooks that have got, you know, like a long list of vocabulary to learn, whereas realistically, some learners might have a capacity to learn 6 new words a lesson. And that would be with a lot of practice. So, you know, thinking that they're going to learn 20 words in an hour, probably not going to happen. So we might need to prioritize, and we might need to find different ways of getting them up to that level of vocabulary. It's really difficult. I know when you're teaching to a curriculum and there's an exam at the end of it and there's a certain amount of vocabulary that they need, it's really hard. But I think prioritizing, and also if you're using multisensory activities, they're more likely to remember. So get them to put the new words to the tune of a familiar song. Right? If they know the tune Happy Birthday, I think almost everybody knows the tune Happy Birthday, get them to sing their new words to the tune of Happy Birthday. And they're much more likely to remember it. Just a final word about materials as well. There's a big push at the moment, well, over the last few years, it's been growing to have more representative materials. So materials which students can see themselves reflected in. And there's quite a wealth of literature which reflect more neurodivergent characters. We do need to see more of that in EFL materials, and there is more coming up. So look out for materials which acknowledge a much wider range of people. And I don't just mean neurodivergent people, but, you know, a range of skin tones and a range of family groups and ages and abilities and interests and aspirations. All of these things, if the students can see themselves in the materials, much more likely to engage. So if you're designing materials, try and think about representing your students in the materials that they're going to be working with. In terms of tasks, I would say try and break things down into small chunks. Just go, you know, little step at a time, and try and build in a lot of recapping and reviewing, bearing in mind that memory is going to be an issue for a lot of students who have specific learning differences. Try and build in a lot of recapping. Try and be as explicit as you can in terms of instructions and feedback, so that they know exactly what you mean. Because you can waste a lot of time in class if you give out instructions and then your neurodivergent learner will find a different way to interpret what you've asked them to do. They will. If there is a different way, they will do it. So try and be as clear as possible, and check that they've understood. I mean, this is general good practice in EFL, isn't it? You're sort of concept checking and your instruction checking to make sure that they do know what it is you want them to do. And similarly, giving feedback, make sure they're clear about what was good. So when you're saying, yeah, good job, what was it that was good and what is their next step? And be as explicit as possible in what the next step is and how they can get there. So if you're going to say, oh, great, yeah, it would be lovely if you use more adjectives. Okay, check that they know what an adjective is. And try and point out where the adjectives could go and what kind of adjectives, where could they find more, you know, give them the strategies that they need to implement the feedback that you're giving them. And again, here we've got multisensory input. So yeah, just using as many different inputs as possible. And even with adult learners, I work with adult learners, don't be afraid of going down the game route. Even if you're teaching business, if you've got a bunch of business executives, they would still be up for a game or two, I reckon, and they can be quite competitive as well. They might be up for a song or two. So don't be afraid, whoever your group is, don't be afraid of introducing more fun activities. I mean, you can talk to them about it beforehand and explain why you think this would be a good activity to do, get them on board. But yeah, I would say as much multisensory input as possible. In terms of layout, for those very busy pages, this is a little, I don't know if you can see, it's a text window. It's literally 2 pieces of L-shaped card, which the student can just put on the page just to help them focus on one little thing, rather than, you know, the whole page being in their face. So that's a very simple device that you could use just to to help students focus on the one task they need to out of the sea of stuff on the page. And quiz and air rods. I love using quiz and air rods. They're very tactile. These are just wooden sticks, different colors, different lengths. They're designed originally for teaching numbers, but you can use them for all sorts of things in language teaching. Just a quick example. So my beginner students are quite good at forming statements, but questions, somehow questions are like a whole different world. So if you can get them to make the statement and just put down a quiz and air rod for each thing, so I like chocolate, when it comes to a question, they can see actually all they need is their do, which is the yellow one. Everything else stays the same. Obviously, they've changed the person because it doesn't make sense. Ask myself, I'm asking you now. So I've changed the person and I've put my do at the front. Otherwise, it's the same order. And when it comes to this third person S, he lived in Britain. This third person S is really tricky for a lot of students. But if they physically have to move that third person S to the do, to make does, they haven't got that third person S there then to put on the live. Is this making sense? So they physically have to move the S. That can be a game changer for a lot of students. If they do quite a few sort of examples of this, where they're literally just putting down the do and moving the S, after a few of those, they're beginning to get the idea. And that physical movement is something which might actually stick for your neurodivergent learners. You don't have to use quiz and air rods. I'm not selling them. I'm not on commission. You can buy them on the internet, but you could use pasta, different forms of pasta, or stones or shells, whatever is available locally, you could use. There's more ideas about these sorts of things in activity books that I've produced, so including Dyslexic Language Learners has got strategies for memory, organization, literacy development, and then these musical activities, really, really good for phonology and also for memory work. Those are available from the ELT Well website. I just want to say a little bit about relationships, because I do think that this is crucial in your inclusive language classroom. It's really, really important that we get to know each other and we understand each other and we accept each other and we respect the differences that you find in any classroom. Even if you look over your class and you see 20 students who are all the same age, the same skin type, similar socioeconomic background, if you get to know them, you will see that there are differences. And finding out what those differences are and valuing, embracing those differences is a really, really powerful learning tool, actually. You can generate a lot of language work from that. But more importantly, I think you develop the relationships, the supportive relationships, so that students are willing to go into pairs, into groups. They know each other. They know who's really good at drawing, for example, if you need some little bit of artwork on your poster, or who's really good at computers, who's really good at spelling, so they know each other's strengths. And you find that they're more willing to work with each other, even the students who are a little bit different from the rest of the group. And the other thing is that we need to be looking for the positive and also always accentuating the positive, praising them for what they've done well. So if you've got a student who is very, very restless, can't sit on his chair for more than 10 minutes, but somehow they manage to stay in their place for, 15 minutes or something, praise them and say, you've done really well today. You haven't got out of your seat today for 15 minutes, so well done you. Any little thing that they do well, anything that you can see they're really engaged, they're really trying hard, praise them for that. The product that they produce may not be the best in the class. They may not have produced the nicest essay or the most beautiful diagram or whatever it is that you're working on. But if you can find something to praise them for, that will make them feel good. That is really motivating. You'll keep them on board that way. There's a lot more activities around self-esteem and around group dynamics in this activities book. This was produced by the IATEFL Inclusive Practices and SEN SIG committee a few years ago. So I was the coordinator at the time, so I edited it. But the activities are by people like Rachel Harris and Giovanni Licata, who you might know, Ron Neves, people who are really, really creative teachers have contributed lovely ideas to these to this collection of activities. So it's worth checking out, particularly I think in terms of developing that inclusive classroom. Because this self-esteem is really, really valuable in terms of learning. We need to believe that we can learn before we can actually learn. And self-esteem, this little diagram is trying to sort of get across the idea that self-esteem is connected to self-awareness. We need to understand ourselves, and we need to understand how we fit into the group and how we belong in the group. And we can do that through self-evaluation as well. So getting students to reflect on their learning at the end of each lesson, just take a minute to say, how did that go? What was easy? What did you find challenging? When you found something challenging, what did you do? You know, and obviously you can grade the language and the concepts for your learners, but even really young learners, even like small children, can answer a question like, did you enjoy that? How did that go today? You know, just how did they feel about it? And then you can start to develop that. Why did you feel that? Did you feel scared? Did you feel proud of yourself? You know, start to explore their emotions, give them the tools to articulate their feelings and really reflect on their learning so that they become much more autonomous in their learning. And that is a really, really valuable skill that we can teach our learners. There is some of this in this book, Raising Awareness of SPLDs. This comic is a comic that Deco Comics put together for me. Oops. It's a story of 5 neurodivergent friends who meet. They move to the big city and they meet in the big city, and they have some challenges that they need to overcome, but they work together to overcome their challenges. It's just a lovely, lovely story. So if you're looking for a feel-good story, which also has a message about accepting diversity, it's also a story of migration, by the way, which for some of us is really, really pertinent. This is a lovely comic, again, from the ELTY website. This is Lexi, who's one of the main characters in the comic. And Lexi is the dyslexic character. And my hope for Lexi is that, okay, so Lexi is the student who really struggles with spelling. You know, you tell him how to spell a word 4 times and he still doesn't quite get it. He's often the last to finish. He's often the student that's not done quite what you expected with the task. But when Lexi looks in the mirror, I don't want him to see that. I don't want him to see the spelling errors. I don't want him to see, you know, the last minute homework. I want him to see this version of himself, the version of Lexi, which just has amazing ideas and is really creative and can see a way around a problem that other people haven't spotted. I want him to look in the mirror and see this fabulous Lexi. And the way that we do that is to project that positivity onto our learners. So when they do have a brilliant idea, even though it's maybe not quite what we were expecting or indeed hoping for, it's still a brilliant idea. And you can still say, Lexi, that is a fantastic idea. We're going to hang on to that idea till next week. It's not quite right for today, but we're going to come back to that next week, you know, and praise them for what they do, praise them for their strengths, for when you see they're really trying, for whatever it is that they do well, praise them in public to the rest of the class, so the rest of the class recognize that they have positive attributes. In the staff room, because these will be the students that when you go into the staff room, there will very often be conversations about these students. They won't always be positive conversations. But if you can change the narrative a little bit by saying, do you know what Lexi came up with today? It was amazing. You can change the perception of other teachers so that other teachers also project positively onto the student. You could get in touch with the parents and say, you know, wow, your son's had a brilliant idea. We'd like to implement it, but it's going to take a bit of time, you know, whatever. Rather than the phone call that a lot of parents of neurodivergent students get about where's the homework? Why haven't they done it? Why do they always forget their pen? You know, those phone calls must be very, very discouraging for parents to keep getting those messages. if they can get a positive message from the teacher, that could be a game changer at home as well. And neurodivergent students really need all of the network around them to be rooting for them to be on their side. So any way that we can change the negative narrative into a positive narrative, I think we should take that opportunity. Don't know if there are any questions at this moment, Teresa.
We haven't we haven't had any questions. There, Stephanie, who also works in speech and language therapy, she's shared a couple of great sites on DLD.
Oh, great.
And then she was also saying, she commented on this a while back, people who have speech sound disorders in their own language as children may be intelligible as teenagers, but still have reading difficulties as adults. Apparently big studies in Cleveland have backed this up. So getting to know a bit about them, how they operate in their own language can help. And I mean, so much of what you've been saying in this session, it's communication, like talking to the students about the environment, talking to your business students before you do a song and, you know, talking about the benefits of it and stuff, talking to the parents about the positive interactions as well. I think it's like communication is a huge thing.
Yeah. So I will, if I may, I'll just wrap up. I'll just wrap up and leave you with this thought. Many of you might recognize this picture, and it represents the Aesop's fable about the north wind and the sun. Yeah. Because I think this is really relevant to our neurodivergent learners. For those of you who don't know the story, I'll just quickly. So here we have a traveler, and the north wind, one day feeling a bit bored, sees his traveler and says to the sun, do you know what, I bet I can make that guy take his cloak off. And the sun said, well, okay, if you want to, have a go. So the wind blows and he blows and he's really cold. And of course, the traveler just pulls his cloak tighter around him. And in the end, the north wind gets fed up and gives up. And he says to the sun, all right, you have a go. So the sun shines and is warm and is lovely. And of course, the traveler immediately takes his cloak off. And the moral of the story is not that we should get our students to take their coats off when they come into class, although that might be a routine that you're in. The moral is, of course, that our neurodivergent learners probably have had quite a lot of cold wind, and what they need in the classroom is a bit of sunshine. So if we can be that warm sunshine, encouraging them, you know, that's probably what they need more than the cold wind that they experience elsewhere. So that's just a nice thought to keep in mind, I think, you know, can we be that sunshine for our learners? So thanks very much for having me on the TEFL Development Hub.
That was tearing up. That was such a lovely kind of analogy to finish with. I think you're right. As I said at the beginning, I am probably very guilty of not recognizing neurodivergence in my students in the past through a lack of awareness. And I probably have been a cold wind on occasion. You know, I mean,
well, Teresa, I mean, we're not trained. There's almost nothing in TEFL training which prepares us for this still. So it's events like this where teachers can find out a bit more. I think, you know, and everybody that's watching this now is doing their best for their learners. So don't beat yourself up, because we've all, you know, we've all been there. With hindsight, we can look back and think, oh, I didn't handle that well, you know. But it's what we do in the future which is really important now. So it's how we go forward, not, you know, what's happened in the past.
You'll be the sunshine from now on. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for coming along for this session this morning. I've learned so much. As I say, I came to it with not a lot of background knowledge, and it's definitely an area, like you say, that we don't reflect on in pre-service qualifications, and not even really as we move through our careers. It's something that teachers really have to look for themselves, rather than being something, certainly in schools that I've worked in, that has been a part of professional development. I don't know what it's like in mainstream schools. I should imagine it's becoming a lot more prevalent, raising people's awareness of these differences. One quick question I do have is, I noticed that you talked about specific learning differences. Is this replacing special educational needs, or?
I hope so. The whole discourse around cognitive differences is constantly evolving, I'm not a big fan of the term special educational needs, because I think that really others people who learn in a different way from the majority. And being special is not necessarily a great thing. And in America, in the USA, they talk about exceptional students, but it's the same thing. It's a euphemism for not being quite as good, basically. So I'm trying to move away from the term special educational needs. I mean, there are so many different terms. Specific learning difficulties is quite common in the UK, but specific learning differences, I think, just reminds us that we are all different. We do all learn in different ways, but for some people, there are specific things which need to be done differently.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I love the fact as well that it's difference rather than difficulty. Even just that change makes it a more positive rather than othering the difference.
I mean, not to diminish the fact that actually dyslexic students will experience difficulties, but it's not inherent within them. It's the difficulty is because of the interaction with the environment that doesn't recognize their difference. So yeah, I think it's a more positive term to talk about learning differences.
I completely agree. I don't think we've had any questions, but obviously if you do have anything, if you're watching this on catch up, you can tag myself or Anne Margaret if you've got a question. She's in the hub, so happy to answer anything. Thank you to everyone who was watching live. Have a great rest of the day wherever you are, and thank you very much again, Anne Margaret, for coming along.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.